It was an unusually warm April morning when the quiet luxury of the village of Little Marlow was ruptured, not by sound, but by silence. Silence that fell too heavily, too suddenly, over the grand estate of Bellamy House. Inside, the soft hush of brushstrokes had ceased, and the usual creak of the upstairs floorboards did not come. Even the birds seemed to pause their song, as if nature itself sensed something had gone wrong. The discovery was made by Miss Helena Snaith, housekeeper of nearly 15 years, who had entered the studio with her usual tray of chamomile tea and a freshly ironed cravat, expecting to find her employer precisely as he had always been at 10 minutes past 10, painting. Instead, what greeted her was a tableau macabre. Julian Havelock, renowned portraitist, art critic, and patron of the eccentric, was slumped backward on the floor, lifeless. One hand clutched at the air, as though reaching for something invisible. His other was pressed against his stomach, a vivid, spreading crimson soaking through his linen shirt. Around him, paint tubes were scattered like upended chess pieces, and on the easel before him sat an unfinished canvas. At first glance, it was an ordinary portrait, a woman in profile, dark hair swept up, delicate features half shrouded in shadows. But something about the image gave Miss Snaith pause. There was a streak of red across the woman's neck, clumsy, brutal, too raw to be artistic. It looked disturbingly like a wound. She screamed. Within the hour, Bellamy House was swarming with constables from the Buckinghamshire Constabulary, led by the solid and unimaginative Inspector Dermot Chase. He was a man who prided himself on common sense and rarely saw the need for foreign interference. But even he had to admit, grudgingly, that this was no ordinary case. Julian Havelock had been one of the most influential figures in the art world. His connections were international, his fortune considerable, and his enemies many. The list of suspects was as cultured as it was colorful. Students, lovers, rivals, and critics. The house was full that weekend, in fact. Havelock had invited a small circle of friends and colleagues to view his latest works before their unveiling at the Royal Exhibition. 6 guests, all accounted for, all shocked, all professing ignorance, all with motives they would rather not discuss. And so it was that 3 days later, a compact figure in a dove-grey suit arrived at Bellamy House, stepping lightly from a black motor car with a small valise in one hand and a walking cane, purely for effect, in the other. His moustache, as always, was impeccable. "I am Hercule Poirot," he announced to the assembled household with a precise bow. "I've come to bring clarity to this most distressing affair." There were murmurs among the guests. Some were relieved, others less so. Poirot began with his usual inspection, not of the scene, but of the people. To him, crimes were rarely committed in isolation. They were born of character, psychology, of secrets gnawed at by time. He seated himself in the drawing-room, hands pressed together like a steeple, and requested a list of guests and their brief biographies. Helena Snaith, brisk and dependable, provided the information with well-practiced efficiency. 1. Cordelia Fane. A rising star in the art world, Cordelia had been Julian's latest protégée and, rumors hinted, something more. Fierce, intelligent, and with an unpredictable temper, she had much to gain by stepping out from Havelock's shadow. 2. Lord Quentin Ainsley, a minor aristocrat with major debts. Ainsley was known to trade art as a means of financial survival. He and Havelock had been in a recent dispute over a misattributed painting that had cost Quentin a small fortune. 3. Dorian Merle, a bitter rival, celebrated for his dark, surrealist works. Merle and Havelock had sparred publicly in several interviews. Each dismissed the other's talents with barely disguised venom. 4. Vivian Skye. A mysterious figure, claimed to be a collector from Monaco. Her papers checked out, but little else was known of her. She'd arrived the day before the murder and was unusually aloof. 5. Miles Cavendish, a former pupil of Havelock's who had become his personal assistant. Unfailingly polite, mild to the point of invisibility, he was responsible for cataloguing the estate's many paintings. 6. Dr. Isabel Kern, an art historian specializing in forgery. She'd worked with Havelock on exposing fraudulent pieces in the past and had joined the gathering ostensibly to advise on provenance matters. Each of them had been present at the estate during the time of death. Each had an alibi, or the semblance of one, but none could explain the altered painting, nor the fact that no weapon had been found. And this canvas, Poirot murmured as he examined the studio that afternoon. Was it altered after the murder or before? Inspector Chase frowned. You think the killer came back to change the painting? Poirot tapped his lip. I think the painting tells a story, and someone, mon cher, has attempted to rewrite it. The canvas was curiously unsettling. The woman's face was turned just enough to imply recognition or accusation. And that crude streak of red, was it paint or blood? Tests suggest it was genuine pigment, not biological. But why place it there, at the throat? Why that particular figure? Poirot leaned in close. The style was unmistakably Havelock's. Yet something felt wrong. The brushwork was inconsistent, the lighting subtly off, as though the painter had tried to mimic Havelock's technique and failed in ways only another artist might notice. But why paint over it? He asked softly to himself. What did the original show? A clue, a face, a hand raised in defiance. The truth, perhaps. He turned to Miles Cavendish, who had followed him into the studio, like a shadow. Tell me, monsieur, was this canvas on the easel the day before the murder? Miles blinked. I think so. He was working on it all week. Said it was the most personal piece he had ever attempted. But he never showed it to anyone. No, Poirot said, his voice laced with intrigue. Because the truth, you see, is often very personal and very dangerous. Later that evening, Poirot sat quietly in the conservatory, sipping a tisane and watching the sunset dip behind the hills. The house behind him was restless, whispers in the halls, closed doors, nervous glances. He welcomed the unease. It meant secrets were stirring, lies were struggling to remain hidden. He closed his eyes. One paints over a truth to conceal it, he murmured. But in doing so, one always leaves behind traces. A stroke too broad, a color too vivid, a hand too uncertain. He opened his eyes, sharp and alive. It is not the painting that matters. It is what was beneath it. The evening drew on, and with it the unsettling feeling that something was about to shift in the stillness of Bellamy House. Poirot had, for the moment, retired to his room, where he sat in deep thought, his hands gently pressing against his temple as though willing his little grey cells to work faster. The puzzle had many pieces, and yet none of them seemed to fit together in any way that made sense. He was not accustomed to feeling stymied, but the murder of Julian Havelock was not a simple crime of passion, nor an obvious robbery gone wrong. This was something more deliberate, more calculated, an intricate web spun from the very brushstrokes of a painter's mind. In the dim light of his room, Poirot stared at the painting of the woman that had so disturbed him. The way the red streak had been added to her throat, almost as though it were an afterthought, something the painter had realized was missing. Had Julian Havelock painted it, or had someone else? The notion of the murderer returning to the scene to tamper with the artwork was, to Poirot, less a possibility than a certainty. And if they had altered the painting, what had been the original intention? What was hidden beneath it? It was the next morning before Poirot could gather the guests for questioning, and the tension among them was palpable. Each was on edge, wary of the detective's unyielding scrutiny. They knew he was no ordinary investigator, and that his mind was an intricate maze of deductions and inferences. The fact that none of them had been able to answer the most basic question, why the canvas had been altered, had kept Poirot up late into the night. The guests were seated in the drawing-room, with Poirot standing at the front. As he entered, there was a momentary hush, a tension that could be cut with a knife. He glanced at each of them in turn, his eyes briefly alighting on the subtle signs of stress they each wore. None were immune to the pressure of suspicion. "Good morning," Poirot said with a precise bow, his voice calm and controlled. "I trust you all slept well." The small talk was pointless, but it was necessary. The detective's eyes flicked over them once more as he spoke. The storm had arrived, and they were trapped inside. "I shall not waste your time with unnecessary formalities," Poirot continued. "We are here to discuss the unfortunate death of Mr. Havelock." He turned to the canvas that had been placed on display in the center of the room. "This, I believe, is the very painting that Mr. Havelock was working on at the time of his demise. But we must ask, why was it altered? Why did the painting change from what it was meant to be to something so disturbing?" Cordelia Fane, seated at the far end of the room, visibly flinched. Her composure was usually so assured, so confident, yet now she had the look of a woman caught in a lie too elaborate to maintain. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice a little too sharp. "It's just a painting. I'm sure Mr. Havelock had his reasons." Poirot turned to her, his gaze cold but polite. But you would know better than most, mademoiselle. After all, you were the one closest to him in his work. Wouldn't you agree?" There was a brief moment of silence, one that was stretched and fragile, before Cordelia spoke again, this time with an air of forced patience. Mr. Havelock was an artist, eccentric, yes, but he never revealed his methods to anyone. He kept things to himself. Poirot nodded, though he knew better than to take her words at face value. But you were the protégé, yes? His favorite. Perhaps you understand things others do not. Perhaps you too could explain why he altered the painting on the eve of his death." Cordelia's face tightened, but she said nothing further. Poirot turned away, his gaze drifting to Lord Quentin Ainsley, who sat with his arms crossed, a typical sign of someone attempting to appear calm while internally restless. "And you, Lord Ainsley," Poirot said, his tone just the right mix of politeness and subtle challenge. "Were you not embroiled in a recent disagreement with Mr. Havelock over that painting he claimed was misattributed?" Ainsley's jaw clenched. "That was a misunderstanding," he snapped. "We disagreed on the provenance of the work, nothing more. Havelock was passionate, shall we say, but there was no ill will between us." "No ill will?" Poirot's voice was smooth, his expression unchanged, but his eyes glittered with the tiniest hint of disbelief. "Forgive me, my lord, but one does not hurl insults at a friend over a misattribution. And if you were so content, why did you not attend the unveiling of Mr. Havelock's works the night before? Surely you were invited." Ainsley's lips pressed into a thin line. "I had other matters to attend to." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Matters that could not be postponed, or were you avoiding Mr. Havelock?" Lord Ainsley shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Poirot moved on, his gaze briefly flicking to Dorian Merle, whose reputation for sharp criticism and sharper temperament had been the subject of many a whispered conversation. The man was a puzzle in himself, an artist whose work was as much about provoking as it was about creation. "Dorian Merle," Poirot said, his voice smooth but incisive. "You and Mr. Havelock have had disagreements in the past, have you not?" Merle glared at Poirot, his lips curling in disdain. "That's putting it mildly," he muttered. "Havelock was a pompous fool. He thought himself above criticism, but his works were predictable, derivative even. And yet you came here, knowing he was presenting new work?" Poirot asked, his tone betraying nothing. Merle's eyes flashed with irritation. "Yes, I came. I wanted to see what he was up to now. Perhaps to see if he had finally abandoned the banal style he had adopted in his later years." Poirot noted the bitterness in Merle's voice, but it was not the anger that concerned him. It was the urgency. The way Merle had insisted on attending, even though his previous comments made it clear he despised Havelock's art. What had he hoped to find in the studio that night? What was he searching for? Poirot's mind buzzed with the possibilities, but he did not voice them. Not yet. Next, Poirot turned his gaze to Vivienne Lescaille, who had been quiet until now. Her mysterious background, coupled with the fact that she had arrived only the day before, had kept her under a cloak of suspicion. Her aloofness was too perfect, a defense against questions she had yet to answer. "You were the last to see Mr. Havelock alive, I believe?" Poirot asked gently, watching her every reaction. Vivienne's smile was faint, but she didn't shy away. "Yes. I admired his work and wanted to discuss a potential acquisition, but it was a brief conversation. He seemed preoccupied." "And did he say anything of importance in those last moments?" Poirot pressed, leaning forward slightly. Vivienne's eyes met his without hesitation. "Nothing that would interest you, I'm afraid. Mr. Havelock was a man obsessed with his own work. He had nothing to say to me that wasn't related to art." Poirot studied her closely for a moment before moving on. Finally, he turned to Miles Cavendish, the assistant. If anyone was to hold the key to the painting's origins, it would be him. He had been there, cataloguing Havelock's work, making sure every piece was preserved and properly displayed. "Miles," Poirot said softly, his voice almost reassuring, "you were present when the painting was altered. You must have seen something." Miles glanced nervously at the others before shaking his head. I didn't see anything, sir. I only worked in the study. Mr. Havelock was often in the studio alone. But you must know what was in that painting before it was changed," Poirot pressed. Miles looked down, his hands trembling. I didn't want to say anything, but there was something odd about it. The face, sir. The woman." "What about the woman?" Poirot interrupted sharply. Miles swallowed hard. It wasn't who he said it was. It was someone else, someone he never mentioned. Poirot's mind raced. A woman, a mystery, a secret painted over in red. His suspicions were beginning to crystallize, and yet the truth was still just out of reach. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his steely eyes never leaving Miles Cavendish as the young man's hands continued to tremble. The words spoken just now were as revealing as they were cryptic. The mention of a woman painted into the artwork, one who was never supposed to be there, tugged at the detective's mind. A woman who had been erased, quite literally, from the narrative Julian Havelock had constructed in his art. But why? The room had grown silent, the weight of Poirot's silence pressing on everyone. His thoughts were swirling, but he said nothing for a long moment, allowing the stillness to speak louder than words ever could. His gaze flicked toward Cordelia Fane, who was no longer maintaining her usual composed facade. Her eyes shifted nervously, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her glove. "Qui est cette femme?" Poirot asked, his voice smooth but carrying an undeniable tension. "This woman who was in the painting, the one that Mr. Havelock chose to hide." Miles opened his mouth but hesitated. His eyes darted around the room as though looking for some ally or approval before he spoke further. I don't know her name, sir, but I've seen her before. Not in the studio, no, but at the gallery a few months ago. She was involved with Mr. Havelock." Poirot's brows rose ever so slightly, his interest piqued. "Involved? How so?" Miles' voice faltered for a moment. "I'm not sure. She wasn't a regular visitor, but Mr. Havelock would occasionally look at her portrait, the one he had painted of her, and he'd become very agitated. He would mutter something under his breath, but he never said anything clearly. I think she had something to do with his recent fall from grace." "Fall from grace?" Poirot repeated, his mind already racing ahead. "What do you mean, Cavendish?" The young man hesitated again, looking between the others in the room. "It's not for me to say, but I think Mr. Havelock had a secret, something dark, and I think that woman was part of it. She might have been the cause of his undoing. Poirot's sharp eyes were now fixed on Cavendish. And what of the woman's portrait? You said he painted her. Was it a likeness, or did she represent something else, a symbol of some sort? Miles swallowed and looked away, struggling with the pressure of the moment. I don't know, but when I last saw the painting, it didn't look like the woman he'd painted before. The face was different. The features were distorted, smeared, as though someone had tried to erase her. Poirot's mind clicked into place, the red streak on the canvas, the added detail of a slash, like the stroke of a knife across the painting's throat. The woman had been erased, and in doing so, something about her had been suppressed, hidden beneath layers of paint. The painting was not merely a portrait, but a map of something far more personal, something that might have cost Havelock his life. What is it about this woman? Poirot muttered to himself, more to his thoughts than to anyone else in the room. His eyes swept over the others, lingering on Cordelia once again, but before he could say anything, the door to the drawing-room opened with a sudden sharpness. Inspector Hamilton entered, looking every bit as tired as he had the night before. His face was drawn with frustration, the evidence of long hours of trying to piece together a case that refused to cooperate. "Poirot, I've just spoken to the servants," Hamilton said briskly. "None of them saw anything unusual last night, but I did find something odd. One of the gallery windows was left ajar, not wide, mind you, just enough that someone could slip through unnoticed." Poirot's gaze flicked to the inspector, his eyes narrowing with interest. "A window, you say? That is curious." "Yes, and there's more," Hamilton continued. "I found traces of something near the window frame, something red. Not paint, though. It looked like blood." The room went silent, the weight of the words sinking in. Poirot's expression remained composed, but his mind was already racing through the implications. A blood-stained window frame, a secret painting, a woman erased from a portrait, and the mention of blood. Was it possible that Havelock had been attacked in his studio before the final blow was struck? "I see," Poirot said, his voice low but precise. "And was this blood trace found inside the studio or on the outside of the window?" "Inside," Hamilton answered, glancing briefly at the others in the room before returning to Poirot, "on the inner ledge, as if someone had pressed their hand against it, leaving a smear." Poirot stood in thoughtful silence, his gaze fixed on the floor. He was piecing together a picture, but the pieces didn't quite fit. Why had the murderer gone to the trouble of hiding the woman in the painting? Why had they altered the artwork instead of destroying it, and why had they left a blood trace on the window ledge? The answers were elusive, but Poirot could sense that the thread was growing stronger. There was a reason behind each action, a reason that was just beyond reach. His mind snapped back to the people before him. Lord Ainsley was watching the proceedings carefully, his arms still crossed, though the tension in his posture had deepened since the conversation had shifted toward the window. Cordelia was restless, her fingers now tugging at her bracelet as though it might distract her from the conversation. Vivian Skye remained serene but distant, and Dorian Merle appeared less self-assured than he had moments ago. Poirot took a step closer to the canvas, as though he could glean something new by standing near it. His gaze lingered on the faint outline of red, a slash across the throat of the woman who had been painted into the story, and then erased. "I will have to see the other portraits," Poirot said finally, turning toward the others. "The paintings that Havelock made of this woman. Perhaps there is something in them that might explain the events of last night." "I thought we had already been through all of his works," Lord Ainsley interjected, his tone skeptical. Poirot turned to face him, his eyes sharp. "Not all. You see, mon ami, the most important portrait may not be in the gallery at all. Perhaps it is hidden." Cordelia's eyes widened imperceptibly, and for a fleeting moment, Poirot caught a flicker of recognition there. She knew something. He was certain of it. "We will search the studio," Poirot continued, his voice steady. "There is a great deal to be uncovered in Havelock's art, and I suspect something is being concealed by the brush strokes themselves." He turned on his heel, motioning for the group to follow him. "Come, we shall go together. The answer may be hidden in plain sight, but it will require careful observation to uncover." As they made their way through the halls, Poirot's mind raced ahead, calculating, rethinking every detail. Someone had tampered with the evidence. Someone had erased the woman from the canvas, and likely from the truth. But who, and why? It was a question that would demand an answer, and Poirot was more than determined to uncover it. Poirot led the small procession through the grand corridors of the estate, his sharp eyes absorbing every detail of the surroundings. The artwork on the walls, the plush carpeting beneath their feet, the muted hum of conversation fading as they passed by. It all felt so peaceful, so normal. Yet beneath the surface, something was desperately wrong. There had been a murder, a hidden woman, a blood-stained window, and now a missing piece to an ever-widening puzzle. The studio door was locked when they reached it, but Poirot's manner was always calm and composed. He didn't even glance at the key. He simply motioned for the butler, who had been trailing behind them, to open the door. The room was exactly as it had been the night before, save for the absence of Havelock's body. The heavy scent of oil paint still lingered in the air, and the easel stood like a sentry in the center of the room, as though it were awaiting the artist's return. On the floor beside it, a palette of mixed colors was carelessly discarded, and the brushes lay scattered in their jar like soldiers fallen in battle. Poirot moved, with deliberate precision, his eyes scanning the space, taking in every inch of the studio. He crossed to the wall where several other portraits hung, each one depicting a person of varying age, stature, and background. But none of these seemed to hold the same kind of weight as the one still sitting on the easel. With a soft exhale, Poirot turned toward the canvas, his gaze flicking over the strokes of paint that had once brought the woman's likeness to life. Now, it was little more than a patchwork of incomplete features, a distorted face where the eyes had been wiped away, the lips blurred, the outline of the figure deliberately smudged. It wasn't merely a defacement. It was a message. "This is the one," Poirot muttered, his fingers tapping his chin thoughtfully. "The truth lies within this portrait, but someone has gone to great lengths to erase it." He circled the canvas, inspecting it with an almost reverent focus, before he stepped back and turned toward the others in the room. Lord Ainsley's expression was unreadable, but he had no doubt been watching Poirot carefully. The man's ever-present air of aloofness seemed to mask something beneath the surface. Poirot noted it without comment, his eyes moving on to Cordelia, who was still on edge, her gloved hands tightly clasped in front of her. It seemed that every move she made now was calculated to hide her emotions, but Poirot had learned long ago that beneath such facades, a truth always festered. "The portrait has been altered," Poirot continued, his voice carrying the weight of his conclusions, "and the manner in which it was done. The haste of it, the precision. Whoever did this was in a rush, a panic. They wanted to remove something, someone who was not meant to be seen." Cordelia flinched imperceptibly, but she said nothing. Poirot turned to face her directly, his eyes sharp. "Mademoiselle Fane, you know something. You know more about this woman than you've let on." She stiffened, but held his gaze. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, her voice steady but with an underlying tension that Poirot could sense even from across the room. Poirot's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "But you do, mademoiselle. You're not unfamiliar with Mr. Havelock's work, nor with the woman in this painting. You've seen her before, have you not?" Her eyes flashed, but she quickly composed herself. "I've no idea what you're implying, Poirot. Julian Havelock was an artist, and I've been in his gallery. Surely that is no crime." Poirot's smile widened, but it was without warmth. Of course. But tell me, mademoiselle, when was the last time you saw this painting in its original form? For a moment she faltered. It was as if Poirot had caught her mid-thought, forcing her to confront a truth she had hoped to remain buried. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but then she closed them again, turning her head sharply toward the canvas as though the answer might lie there. Poirot let the silence stretch, his gaze never leaving her face. The woman in the painting. You knew her, didn't you? Finally, Cordelia's composure cracked, if only slightly. I knew her, but she was nothing to me. Poirot raised an eyebrow, leaning in slightly. Ah, but was she nothing to him, to Mr. Havelock? Cordelia's expression faltered, and she glanced down at her hands, now wringing her gloves in anxiety. She was his muse. That's all, she said quickly, the words rushing out. But it was nothing serious. She was just some model he used for his work. Poirot's gaze softened, though it held a quiet intensity. There is more to this story, mademoiselle. Much more. Tell me, who is she? Her eyes met his again, this time filled with a mix of resignation and fear. Her name was Olivia Marchant. She was a woman with a past, one that Julian never spoke of. But I know she was more than a muse. She was someone who could ruin him. Poirot gave a small nod, as though he were absorbing every word, every subtle nuance. And you feared she might ruin him? Why? Cordelia swallowed, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Because she knew things. Things about his past that could destroy everything he had worked for. Julian wasn't always the man he was now. He was involved in something dark. A cold shiver ran down Poirot's spine. This was the crux of it. The woman had been a threat to more than just the artist's reputation. She had been a threat to something far more personal, something hidden away in the past. And you, mademoiselle, Poirot continued, did you ever ask him about this past? Did you ever ask him about Olivia Marchant? Cordelia's lips pressed tightly together, her eyes glistening with something close to fear. I tried. But Julian would never talk about her. And when I insisted, he would become angry. He told me to forget her, that she was irrelevant, but I never did. I could never forget her. I knew she was the reason he was so secretive, so distant. Poirot nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in his mind. He turned toward the rest of the room, his gaze now sweeping across everyone present. They were all connected, but in ways that none of them seemed to fully comprehend yet. The past, it seems, Poirot mused, his voice barely above a whisper, is a shadow that haunts us all, and Olivia Marchant, this woman, is the key to unlocking it. At that moment, the door to the studio opened, and Inspector Hamilton stepped in, his face grim. Poirot, we've found something else. You need to see this. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. Another revelation, something that would push the investigation closer to the truth. With a final glance at Cordelia, who seemed to be struggling with the weight of the truth she had just shared, Poirot moved toward the door. I shall see it, mon ami, he said, his voice steady. Let us go. Time is of the essence. And as he followed Hamilton down the corridor, Poirot's mind was already turning, calculating the new information like a finely tuned machine. Olivia Marchant, the hidden woman, the key to the truth. And yet there was something more, something he had yet to discover. Poirot followed Inspector Hamilton down the dimly lit hallway, his mind racing. The mention of something else was enough to send a thrill of anticipation through him. Each step he took felt calculated, measured, like a chess player preparing for the final move. Hamilton led him to a small room at the end of the hall where the curtains had been drawn shut, leaving the space in a quiet, somber gloom. Inside, a single table was cluttered with papers and various artifacts, the remnants of an ongoing investigation. At its center, however, was a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he approached the table, the tension in the air thickening with every second that passed. "What have you found?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge of curiosity. Hamilton looked uncomfortable, glancing briefly at the cloth before meeting Poirot's gaze. "It's a letter. It was found in the desk drawer of Havelock's studio. We didn't think much of it at first, but then we noticed the date. It was written just days before the murder." Poirot's pulse quickened, and he reached for the cloth, carefully unfolding it. A pale, yellowed piece of stationery was revealed. The handwriting, elegant but hurried, scrawled across the page with a kind of desperation that seemed at odds with the poised world of high society. The letter was short, but its contents were enough to make Poirot's mind begin to race. "Dearest Julian, I cannot stay silent any longer. I know what you've done, and I will not allow you to use me as a pawn in your games. The truth will come to light, whether you like it or not. Meet me tonight at the studio. You'll want to hear what I have to say. Olivia." Poirot read the letter twice, then a third time, his mind working at lightning speed to dissect every word, every implication. Olivia Marchant. This was the woman, the one whose existence had been a shadow over the artist's life. And now, she was gone, vanished. But this letter, this final communication from her, was the key to understanding the last moments of her life. A final warning, Poirot murmured to himself, as though the letter itself was speaking to him. A warning that would have been impossible to ignore. Hamilton shifted uncomfortably, watching Poirot as the detective carefully folded the letter back into its cloth. "We've tried to locate Olivia's whereabouts, but she seems to have disappeared without a trace. We were hoping you might shed some light on this." Poirot's fingers tapped lightly against his chin, his expression thoughtful. "You are correct, my friend. She vanished, just as she intended. But her message, this letter, tells us everything we need to know about her intentions. She was not only trying to expose Havelock, she was trying to make him act. But the question remains, why now? Why did she feel the need to take this step just days before her death?" Hamilton, who had been observing Poirot closely, frowned. "You think she was murdered because of this letter?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with a mixture of certainty and calculation. "I do. And I believe that whoever killed her wanted to ensure that this letter, this threat, never saw the light of day. It is possible that Havelock was too afraid to let her expose him, but I think there is more at play. Someone wanted to make sure Olivia Marchant was silenced permanently." Poirot turned to the inspector, his gaze piercing. "And I believe the killer is among us, perhaps even in this very room." Hamilton shifted uneasily. "I can't see how that's possible. We've spoken to everyone involved. There's no clear motive." Poirot shook his head. "Ah, but that is precisely the point. No one ever expects the truth to lie so close, so hidden in plain sight. Everyone has a secret, Inspector, and it is our job to uncover it." Hamilton seemed to struggle with this, but before he could respond, Poirot held up a hand, signaling for silence. His eyes darted back to the letter. "This letter does not only speak of Havelock's fear, it speaks of Olivia's resolve. She was willing to confront him, and yet she never made it to the studio. Why?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight, but Poirot didn't give anyone time to respond. He stepped to the side of the room, his mind working furiously, piecing together fragments of conversation, clues and emotions like a master sculptor chiseling away at a block of marble. Then he turned back to Hamilton with a sharp glint in his eyes. "Tell me," Poirot said, his voice low but firm, "where exactly was the body found?" Hamilton blinked, a moment of hesitation before he answered. "In the study, near the window, the one overlooking the garden." Poirot's expression darkened. A clear view of the garden, a place where someone could be seen from a distance. Hamilton nodded slowly, not yet understanding the significance of Poirot's observation. "Yes, that's right. But what? Poirot's eyes flared with sudden realization. It is not a question of where the body was found, Inspector. It is a question of who could have been seen. This is no random act of violence. Whoever murdered Olivia Marchant was someone who knew where she would be, someone who knew her movements, her habits, someone who could easily anticipate her actions. The inspector's face began to redden as the implications began to sink in. You mean, Poirot held up a hand to silence him. Precisely. Olivia was being watched. She was never alone, not for one moment. And her killer knew this. They knew she would come to the studio. They knew she would have that letter with her, and they knew how to make sure she was never able to speak the truth. Poirot's mind was already leaping forward, his instincts taking him to places no one else had yet imagined. The pieces were aligning in a way that spoke of careful preparation, of someone who had been playing a long game, someone who understood the power of secrecy and the lengths they would go to in order to protect it. Hamilton stepped forward, visibly shaken. But who could have done it? We've questioned everyone, Poirot. Havelock, his associates, even Cordelia. Poirot's gaze softened, though his eyes remained sharp. Ah, but you have missed something, Inspector. Everyone in this house has something to hide. Everyone has their own fears and desires. But there is one person whose motive remains unclear. He turned to Hamilton, a glint of triumph in his eyes. I am not wrong in saying that it is time for another question to be asked. The killer, he or she, did not just want to silence Olivia. They wanted to send a message, and I believe they did it in a way that no one could have suspected. Poirot stood tall, his mind now made up. I must return to the studio. There is something there I have yet to see. With that, he turned on his heel, his sharp footsteps echoing down the hallway. The game was afoot, and Poirot was closing in on the truth. The killer was close, and soon they would reveal themselves. Poirot's footsteps were light but purposeful as he retraced his path back to the artist's studio. His mind was a maze of calculations, each turn and twist revealing something more intricate than the last. Hamilton had been eager to follow, but Poirot had insisted on visiting the scene alone. There was something about the room, the atmosphere, the way the shadows danced on the walls that spoke to him in a way that others might not have understood. The studio, still untouched since the discovery of Olivia's body, was bathed in a soft, almost eerie twilight. The tall windows allowed just enough light to penetrate the gloom, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with each passing moment. It was a place of creation, of inspiration, but tonight it felt more like a tomb, silent, cold, and still. Poirot moved toward the center of the room, his eyes scanning the space with that familiar, almost unnatural precision. The easel stood in the corner, as if waiting for the next brushstroke. But it wasn't the art that held his attention now. His eyes flicked toward the desk, the same place where Olivia's final letter had been discovered. The clutter of papers, half-drawn sketches, and forgotten tools now seemed to carry a weight that went beyond the artist's routine chaos. Something was out of place, something too deliberate to be ignored. Poirot's gaze settled on a stack of canvases leaning against the wall. They were large and imposing, their surfaces draped with old cloths. The faintest scent of oil paint hung in the air, and as Poirot stepped closer, the light caught a glimpse of something unusual. One of the canvases had been moved. Not much, just enough to catch the eye of anyone who was paying attention. It was subtle, but Poirot's mind immediately began to connect the dots. He reached out with delicate fingers, lifting the corner of the cloth, and as the canvas was revealed, Poirot felt a tightening in his chest. The painting was almost complete. An unsettling portrait of Olivia Marchant, her face captured in stunning detail. The artist had painted her with an almost unnatural intensity, her eyes staring out at the viewer with a mixture of defiance and despair. But what struck Poirot most was the background. The carefully rendered studio, the soft glow of the light, the subtle play of shadows. Everything was precisely as it had been when Olivia was last alive. It was as though Havelock had captured the scene of her death in a single stroke. A shiver ran down Poirot's spine. It was no ordinary painting. It was a record, a haunting visual confession. Poirot stepped back, his eyes scanning the room again. His instincts were at full throttle now, each detail, every brushstroke, every movement, becoming a clue in the puzzle he was piecing together. He took a deep breath, centering himself before he reached for his notebook and began making careful notes. He wrote down everything, the positioning of the furniture, the angle of the easel, the way the light played on the canvas. And as he did, he felt a growing certainty that the key to understanding Olivia's murder lay right here, hidden in plain sight. But it wasn't just the painting that called to him. It was something else. Something he had noticed in the letter, the subtle hint of fear, the cryptic warning Olivia had written to Julian. She had known something, and she had been willing to expose it. The question was, what had she discovered? What secret was Havelock hiding? Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the door. He turned, his sharp eyes narrowing, and within moments the figure of Inspector Hamilton appeared in the doorway. The inspector's face was flushed, his expression tense. "You were right," Hamilton said, his voice betraying the stress he was under. "I've just spoken to Havelock. He's not the man we thought he was." Poirot raised an eyebrow, intrigued but not surprised. "Go on, mon ami." Hamilton stepped into the room, glancing nervously at the paintings lining the walls. He was evasive, avoided direct answers. And then, when I pressed him, he admitted something about Olivia's relationship with him. They were more than just acquaintances. He didn't want anyone to know, not even Cordelia. Poirot's eyes flickered with interest. "Ah, now we see the first crack in the armor. Tell me, Inspector, what exactly did he admit?" Hamilton took a deep breath, as though gathering himself before delivering the news. Havelock said that Olivia had been blackmailing him. She knew about something he had done, and she'd been threatening to expose him unless he agreed to certain terms, but he insisted that it wasn't the reason for her death. He says he didn't kill her. In fact, he seemed genuinely shaken by the whole affair. Poirot's gaze shifted to the painting once more, then back to Hamilton. "I find it difficult to believe that a man like Havelock would confess so openly to such an indiscretion without feeling the heat of a lie on his lips. But perhaps he is telling the truth. The truth as he understands it, at least." Hamilton looked perplexed. "So, you think he's innocent?" Poirot shook his head, his expression contemplative. No, not quite. I believe Havelock's role in this tragedy is more complicated than we have been led to believe, but I also believe he is not the murderer. I would not be so quick to absolve him, however. There are too many contradictions, too many unanswered questions." Hamilton sighed, clearly frustrated by Poirot's cryptic response. "So, what now? What do we do next?" Poirot straightened up, his eyes gleaming with the quiet certainty that only he could maintain in the face of uncertainty. "We return to the scene, Inspector. We look for the things that no one else would see. There is a reason Olivia wrote that letter, and there is a reason she came here. We must understand her motives before we can understand hers, and ultimately, the murderers." Hamilton nodded, though his confusion was evident. "You believe someone else was involved?" Poirot turned his eyes toward the door, a knowing smile curving at the edges of his lips. "Indeed I do. There is someone here among us who has been watching, waiting, someone who has been lying to us all." The detective moved toward the door, his presence commanding and assured. "Come, Inspector. We have much more to uncover, and I do not believe we are far from the truth." The two men made their way through the house, their minds aligning as Poirot's little grey cells spun webs of logic and insight. The game was still afoot, and the pieces, though scattered, were beginning to come together. Whoever had killed Olivia Marchant had made a critical mistake. and Poirot was about to reveal it. Poirot's thoughts whirled as he and Hamilton walked through the halls of the grand estate, the silence between them only interrupted by the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. The weight of the investigation was bearing down on the detective. The contradictions, the half-truths, the subtle insinuations, all were pieces of a puzzle that, at first glance, seemed to be falling into place, but Poirot knew better. The most elegant mysteries were those that defied the most obvious conclusions. They paused at the staircase, the soft light from the chandelier above casting long shadows on the walls. The house felt like a museum, a collection of memories frozen in time, where each object seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the revelation of the truth. Poirot's gaze flickered to a painting on the wall, a portrait of a man with sharp features and an unreadable expression. "Do you see, Inspector?" Poirot asked, his voice smooth but tinged with a quiet intensity. "This house is a stage, and all of them, the players, the actors in this tragic drama, are performing whether they know it or not. But their performance, it is flawed. There is always something they wish to conceal." Hamilton shifted uneasily. "Who, Poirot? Who is concealing the truth?" Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. "Patience, mon ami. Patience. We are not yet at the end of the road, but every step we take brings us closer." Their first stop was to visit Julian Havelock once more. Poirot had grown more certain with each passing moment that the key to unraveling this mystery lay in understanding the relationships between Olivia, Havelock, and Cordelia. Julian's behavior, his strained interactions, and his attempts to deflect suspicion all spoke of a man who had more to hide than he would admit. They arrived at the study where Havelock had been earlier, and the artist was now sitting in a leather chair by the window, his eyes distant as he gazed out over the garden. He turned only slightly as they entered, his face betraying nothing but fatigue. "I had hoped I would not see you again so soon," Havelock said, his voice hoarse but steady. Poirot's eyes studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. "But, Monsieur Havelock, I'm afraid we must continue our conversation. There are still too many questions left unanswered. You spoke of blackmail, but there is more to this than you know, perhaps more than even you realize." Hamilton stepped forward, his voice tense. "We need the truth, Havelock. If you know something, anything, now is the time to speak." Havelock met Hamilton's gaze but remained silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he stood and walked toward the window, his fingers brushing lightly against the glass as he turned back to face them. "Ça, she was going to ruin me," he said quietly. "Olivia had found out everything. She knew about the business dealings, the missteps, and Cordelia." He broke off, a troubled look crossing his face. Poirot took a step closer, his voice measured. "And Cordelia, monsieur? What role does she play in this?" Havelock's eyes darted around the room, his lips pressed tightly together as if he had said too much. "Cordelia is my wife. But she doesn't understand. She doesn't know what I did to survive, what I had to do." Poirot's mind raced, and he exchanged a glance with Hamilton. "I think, Monsieur Havelock, that there is much you are not telling us, but I am patient. I will wait for the pieces to fall into place." The artist didn't respond. Instead, he sank back into his chair, his hands clasped in front of him, his face hidden in shadow. Poirot gave a small nod. "We shall leave you for now, but remember, monsieur, the truth always comes to light, no matter how well you hide it." As they exited the study, Hamilton shot a glance at Poirot, his expression one of frustration. What was that? He's clearly hiding something, but he's not saying anything concrete. Poirot paused, considering the inspector's words carefully. "He's hiding many things, yes, but you see, the truth is like a river, mon ami. It does not run straight, and it is not always clear. But if you watch long enough, you will see the current shift, and when it does, all will be revealed." Hamilton wasn't entirely convinced, but he knew better than to argue. Poirot's instincts had rarely failed him, and the detective seemed to be moving with a certainty that was almost unnerving. Their next stop was Cordelia Havelock, the enigmatic wife who had been conspicuously absent from the earlier investigation. It was time to confront her, and Poirot was already formulating his questions as they made their way through the winding corridors of the estate. Cordelia was in the drawing room, seated near a grand piano, her fingers lightly brushing the keys, but not playing. The moment she saw Poirot and Hamilton, she set the piano's lid down with a soft click and looked up at them with a calm, almost detached expression. "Inspector, Monsieur Poirot," she greeted them with a soft voice, though her eyes flickered with the briefest hint of tension. "I wasn't expecting you to return so soon." Poirot regarded her closely. "Madame Havelock, it is crucial that we speak with you. There are matters concerning your husband." "My husband?" Cordelia interrupted, her lips curving into a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've already told you everything I know. I've been clear about my lack of involvement." Poirot's eyes narrowed and he stepped forward slightly, his voice smooth yet probing. "You see, madame, I do not believe you. There are too many contradictions in your story, too many things you wish to conceal." She stiffened at his words, her gaze flickering for a split second before she regained her composure. "I have nothing more to say, Monsieur Poirot. If you wish to accuse me, then go ahead." Poirot's expression softened and he raised a hand as though to calm her. "No accusations, madame, but I believe we both know that the truth is more elusive than it seems, and sooner or later it will come to light, whether you wish it or not." Cordelia stared at him for a long moment, the silence between them heavy and pregnant with unspoken words. Finally, she stood and moved toward the window, her gaze lost in the distance. "Perhaps," she said softly, "it will. But I fear that when it does, you may not like what you find." Poirot did not respond, but his mind was already racing. There was something in her words, something in the way she held herself, that spoke of a deeper truth buried beneath the surface. The puzzle was becoming clearer and yet more complex at the same time. As Poirot and Hamilton left the drawing room, the detective's gaze turned back toward the grand staircase. His instincts told him that the game was nearing its end. Someone had been hiding the truth all along, and soon Poirot would uncover who that person was and why Olivia Marchant had paid the ultimate price for it. Poirot and Hamilton made their way back to the sitting room where the investigation had first begun. The house felt quieter now, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the detective to take the next step. In his mind, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture, but there were still too many gaps. The contradictions, the half-spoken truths, and the psychological games being played by the Havelocks were far from finished. Poirot's gaze swept over the familiar room, lingering on the fireplace where the crackling fire had once offered warmth but now only seemed to add to the tension in the air. His thoughts turned to the portrait of Olivia Marchant that had dominated the scene of the crime. There was something about her, something in the way she had held herself, that now seemed more significant than it had been at first. Was she truly the innocent victim, or was there something darker hidden beneath that poised exterior? "Poirot," Hamilton said, breaking the detective's reverie. "What now? We've spoken to both Havelocks. Each of them is hiding something, but neither of them seems like the killer. If Olivia's murder was tied to one of them, I can't see how." Poirot turned toward Hamilton, his face unreadable. "No, mon ami, you're not seeing the full picture. Each of the Havelocks has played their part in this tragedy, but the murderer is someone else entirely. We have focused too much on them. The true criminal is someone who has managed to stay in the shadows." Hamilton blinked in surprise. "You mean it wasn't them?" Poirot nodded slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of his chin. "I believe we have overlooked one very important detail, a detail that is as simple as it is profound. The artist's brush." The detective's words hung in the air for a moment before Hamilton responded. The brush? Yes, Poirot replied, his voice calm, yet tinged with the thrill of a revelation. It is not just any brush. It is the brush used to create the final touch in that tragic painting, the one that Olivia Marchant held. That brush contains the clue we missed, Hamilton. The brush was a symbol, not just of art, but of something more. Hamilton's brow furrowed. You're losing me, Poirot. How can a brush lead us to the murderer? Poirot's lips curved into a small smile. Ah, but you see, mon ami, it is not the brush that is important. It is who wielded it and why. The person who painted over the crime, who altered the scene, has been hiding in plain sight. The detective's eyes sparkled with the energy of a man who had uncovered the core of the mystery. Hamilton, still trying to follow, leaned forward. Who could it have been, Poirot? Poirot's gaze shifted toward the door as if he could see through the walls. The key to solving this case is understanding that the murder was staged. Olivia's death, while tragic, was not an impulsive crime. It was carefully orchestrated, manipulated by someone who sought to rewrite the narrative, to cover up something far more sinister. Hamilton's eyes widened as he began to piece it together. You mean someone who altered the crime scene to hide the real cause of death? Someone who was trying to erase their involvement? Poirot gave a subtle nod. Exactly, and that person is not Julian Havelock or Cordelia. The painter, the one who created the illusion of a perfect crime, was the victim's own cousin, Sebastian Marchant. Hamilton looked taken aback. Sebastian? But he was here the entire time. He was with us when we arrived. He couldn't have... Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. No, Hamilton, that is exactly the point. Sebastian Marchant has been in plain sight the entire time. His role in this mystery has been hidden, obscured by the more obvious suspects. But if you look carefully at the timeline, the clues fall into place. Timeline? Hamilton repeated, still struggling to connect the dots. What timeline? Poirot's eyes gleamed with the precision of a man who had solved the riddle of a lifetime. The timing of Olivia's death, mon ami, is key. If you recall, Olivia's body was discovered in the early hours of the morning, but the house was not disturbed in any way. There were no signs of a struggle, no noise to alert the household. It was as if she had died in her sleep. But how could that be? Hamilton's gaze sharpened. The scene was too perfect, too quiet, and the room... Exactly, Poirot interrupted. Olivia was murdered in a way that suggested a calm and serene passing. But that was only because someone had carefully staged it to look that way. Sebastian Marchant, her cousin, was the one who saw his opportunity. And what better way to hide his crime than to pose it as an accidental death or even as a suicide? A quick swipe of the brush, and the murder was concealed. Hamilton's face tightened with realization. So, you think Sebastian was the one who killed her? Poirot nodded. It was a crime of necessity, not passion. Olivia had been blackmailing him. She had discovered his secret dealings, his financial troubles, his ties to illegal art forgeries, and his embezzlement. She was going to expose him, and that would have been the end of his career, his reputation, his life. But in her death, he could erase the truth she knew. But the brush, Hamilton persisted. What does it mean? The brush was the weapon of choice, Poirot explained, his tone more intense now. Sebastian used it not only to hide the crime, but also to assert his control over the situation. He painted over the chaos of his own actions, just as he sought to paint over the truth. The painting in the gallery, the one where Olivia had posed. Do you remember it? Hamilton nodded. Yes, I do. The one where she looked so serene, so composed. That was Sebastian's work, Poirot said with finality. He had painted it, but it wasn't just any painting. It was a symbol of the perfect life he had been trying to create. A life free of consequence, but in his rush to cover his tracks, he didn't consider how much the painting would implicate him. The stroke of the brush on that portrait was not an innocent action. It was an admission of guilt. Hamilton's gaze moved from Poirot to the door of the study, the implications of the detective's words sinking in. So, we confront him now. Poirot's smile was faint but knowing. No, not yet. There is still one more step to take. The final piece of the puzzle is hidden in plain sight. We must gather everyone and expose the truth once and for all. The guilty party cannot escape the light forever. Hamilton nodded, his hand tightening around the handle of the door as he prepared to face the inevitable showdown. Then let's do it. As they moved toward the hallway, Poirot's mind raced with the details of the case. The game was nearly over. The pieces were in their rightful places, and the truth was about to be revealed. All it took was one final revelation, and soon Poirot would see to it that justice was served, no matter the cost. As Poirot and Hamilton made their way down the narrow corridor, the sound of their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of the house. Each step brought them closer to the confrontation that was about to unfold. Hamilton could feel the tension mounting in his chest. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place, but the weight of the truth still loomed large. The house, though elegant and refined in its design, now felt like a mausoleum, its halls echoing with the ghosts of secrets that had long been buried. Yet the weight of the lies that had taken root here had become impossible to ignore. The air was thick with anticipation. Poirot, ever composed, walked ahead, his gait as measured as ever, though there was a sharpness to his movements now, as if the final unraveling of the mystery was within reach. He stopped in front of the sitting-room door, turning to Hamilton with a glance that was equal parts reassurance and command. "It is time, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice soft but firm. "Gather the suspects. We must finish this." Hamilton nodded and stepped toward the door. Poirot's words had always held a certain power over him, but today there was something more, something almost unsettling in their tone. It was the certainty that Poirot was not merely solving a case, but exposing the darkest parts of human nature itself. They entered the sitting room together, and the assembled group of suspects, the Havelocks, Sebastian, and a few others, looked up from their scattered conversations. The atmosphere had changed. What had once been idle chatter now felt hollow, as though everyone in the room knew that the endgame was approaching. All eyes were drawn to Poirot, whose mere presence seemed to command attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a razor. "The time has come for the truth to be laid bare." The room fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Everyone stood motionless, their faces a mixture of uncertainty and dread. Sebastian Marchant, his normally well-groomed appearance now slightly disheveled, was leaning against the mantel, his eyes wary. Cordelia Havelock, the heiress, sat with her arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Julian Havelock, his face a mask of controlled concern, stood near the window, his gaze flickering between Poirot and the rest of the group. Poirot's eyes swept over the room, taking in the subtle signs of discomfort in each of them, the shift in posture, the nervous glances exchanged between Sebastian and the others. He could see the cracks in their carefully constructed facades. They were all complicit in some way, but only one of them had crossed the line into murder. "You will excuse me," Poirot continued, his voice calm yet authoritative, "but I must take you through the details one final time, for you have all played your part in this affair, and only by understanding your roles can the true murderer be revealed." He turned toward Hamilton, who stepped forward, taking his place beside Poirot. Together, they began to recount the events, piecing the puzzle together in a way that only Poirot could. "The murder of Olivia Marchant was not a crime of passion," Poirot began, his voice steady. "It was not a spur-of-the-moment act. No, this was a cold, calculated act of self-preservation. Olivia Marchant was no mere victim. She was a woman in possession of dangerous knowledge, and she had been threatening to expose the secrets of those who surrounded her." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The room remained deathly quiet. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on Sebastian Marchand as he spoke. Sebastian Marchand, Poirot continued, had much to lose. His financial troubles, his illegal dealings with art forgeries. These were not the sort of things one could easily walk away from. And when Olivia discovered these things, she threatened to ruin him. But Sebastian had a plan. He had the means to silence her, and he took them. Sebastian's lips tightened as Poirot's words struck home. "I didn't," he began, but Poirot raised a hand to silence him. "Non, monsieur, you did not act alone. You had help. Someone in this room assisted you. But you, Sebastian, you were the one who murdered Olivia. You painted over the crime, quite literally, to erase the evidence." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Cordelia's eyes widened in shock, while Julian's face darkened with anger. Sebastian stood frozen, his face paling as the reality of Poirot's accusation settled in. "Do you deny it?" Poirot asked, his voice colder now. Sebastian swallowed hard but said nothing. His eyes flicked toward the others in the room as if seeking an escape, but the truth had already taken root. Poirot turned to the others, his eyes scanning their faces with cold precision. "The painting that was found in Olivia's room, the one where she posed so gracefully, was your doing, was it not, Sebastian? You painted it, and you used it to hide your crime. You staged Olivia's death to look as though it were nothing more than an accident, a natural death. But you could not erase the truth." Hamilton, having heard the story unfold before him, now stepped forward. "And the brush," he added. "It wasn't just the instrument used to finish a painting, it was the means by which Sebastian tried to erase the murder." Sebastian's face contorted with frustration. "You don't understand," he spat, his voice growing increasingly desperate. "She would have ruined me. You don't know what it's like to lose everything." But Poirot remained unmoved. "I understand perfectly well, monsieur, but in trying to hide your guilt, you only made it more apparent. The brush was not just used for art, it was used to erase the truth which is now being revealed." The room was heavy with the weight of Sebastian's guilt, and even he could not deny the evidence laid before him. But it wasn't just his actions that had sealed his fate. It was the way he had manipulated the others around him. Poirot had seen through it all. "You see," Poirot said softly, his eyes never leaving Sebastian's, "there is a pattern in your actions, monsieur. You thought you could outsmart the truth, but the truth is relentless. It always finds a way to reveal itself." The room seemed to hold its breath as Poirot turned toward the others, the gravity of his words settling in. "And now, the murderer will face justice." Sebastian's shoulders slumped, his last bit of defiance fading away. The weight of the truth crushed him, and as he finally turned to face the reality of his actions, Poirot's voice rang out with a finality that left no room for doubt. "The game is over, Monsieur Marchand. You have been caught." Hamilton stepped forward, signaling for the others to call for the authorities. Sebastian's fate was sealed, but as the detective turned to leave, he couldn't help but reflect on the nature of human frailty, how easily secrets were buried, how deftly they were disguised beneath layers of lies, and how, in the end, the truth always found its way to the surface. As Poirot made his way toward the door, his thoughts were a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Another case solved, another criminal unmasked. But in the silence that followed, he couldn't help but wonder about the cost of such revelations, and as he left the room, his voice, ever composed, offered one last observation, a quiet remark to no one in particular. Justice, it seems, is a painting that must be completed with the stroke of truth. The police arrived not long after Sebastian Marchand was led away, his expression blank as the officers escorted him from the room. The silence that followed his departure was palpable. The once tense atmosphere, full of uncertainty and suspicion, was now pierced with a quiet, almost reverent relief. The mystery was resolved. But Poirot knew better than to allow anyone to indulge too freely in that sense of closure. He glanced around at the assembled group of suspects. Now their roles in the game were finished, yet there was no jubilation in their faces. Only exhaustion, disbelief, and, for some, a residual fear. It was as though they had been trapped in a shadow that had only just been lifted, and while the daylight was welcome, it did nothing to erase the sting of what had transpired. Julian Havelock stood at the far side of the room, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His gaze was focused on nothing in particular, and for a moment Poirot thought he might be lost in some internal conflict. Perhaps the shock of knowing that his own wife, Olivia, had known too much, had been the catalyst for the betrayal. Or perhaps he had feared for his own reputation, given the scandalous nature of Sebastian's involvement. Either way, Julian's stoic silence was unnerving. Cordelia Havelock, however, was not as composed. She stood beside the fireplace, her posture stiff, her fingers tracing the rim of a nearby glass, as though she could glean some meaning from the movement. Her eyes flicked toward Sebastian's departure, and though she had remained silent throughout Poirot's deductions, her face had betrayed more than she realized. A sharpness, a flicker of guilt, perhaps, had passed over her features in that brief moment when Poirot spoke of the collaboration between Sebastian and someone in the room. It had taken a particular insight into human behavior, into their true motivations, to understand that Cordelia Havelock's interest in the truth was not as straightforward as it seemed. Her manner was one of the most carefully crafted in the room, and while she had been outwardly respectful toward Poirot throughout the investigation, the cracks in her composure had started to show. Poirot observed her closely, as one would study a painting for hidden details, his mind working at full speed to reconcile the pieces that hadn't yet come together. "Hamilton," Poirot said, breaking the silence, "I would appreciate it if you would kindly escort the others to their rooms. There is a need for some time alone, to reflect upon the events that have unfolded." Hamilton, who had been standing at Poirot's side, nodded and immediately turned to the group, his expression courteous but firm. The group, still in shock, moved slowly, with each of them retreating into the privacy of their chambers. One by one, they left the room, though Cordelia lingered for a moment, her gaze fixed on Poirot. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Poirot could see the subtle tremor in her hands. She was trying to maintain her composure, but beneath the surface, something was unraveling. Poirot knew that this was not over. Not yet. "Mon ami," Poirot said, turning to Hamilton, "we are not yet finished with our investigation. There is one more thing that requires our attention." Hamilton looked at him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "Poirot, we've solved the case. Sebastien is the murderer. We've found the motive. What more could there be?" Poirot's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "Ah, mon ami, it is never that simple. There are always layers to be peeled back, like the petals of a flower. In this case, we have only begun to scratch the surface. One piece remains hidden from view." Hamilton frowned. "You think there's someone else involved?" Poirot's eyes flickered toward the door, where Cordelia had disappeared moments before. "Indeed. But the person I suspect has not yet revealed their true role in this matter. It is not just the murder itself that we must understand, but the motives that fueled it, the reasons that led to this final, fatal act." Hamilton's expression softened, a look of realization dawning on him. "You mean Cordelia?" Poirot nodded, his gaze sharp. "Exactly. It is her we must focus on now." With purposeful steps, Poirot moved toward the door, signaling for Hamilton to follow. The two men walked down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. They reached Cordelia's room, and Poirot, with his usual meticulousness, knocked softly. There was a brief pause before the door opened. Cordelia stood before them, her posture still composed, though there was a wariness in her eyes. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but Poirot spoke first. "Mademoiselle Havelock, may we come in?" Cordelia hesitated, her gaze flickering toward Hamilton before she stepped aside, allowing the two men to enter. The room was tastefully decorated, but the air was thick with an uneasy tension. She motioned for them to sit, and Poirot did so with his characteristic calm. "Is there something you wish to say to me, Poirot?" she asked, her voice cool, though not without a trace of something else, something more fragile. Poirot studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I do not believe you are as innocent in all of this as you have led us to believe." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you accusing me, Poirot?" Poirot smiled faintly, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "No, mademoiselle, not yet. But the evidence is there if one knows how to look. You see, Cordelia, the key to understanding this entire affair is not merely the murder, but the cover-up. And what I have noticed is that the final pieces of this puzzle were never quite where they should have been." He paused, letting the words settle in the air. "It was you who suggested the idea of a painting. Of course, Sebastian took it upon himself to execute it, but it was you who provided him with the motivation." Her face remained carefully neutral, but Poirot could see the muscles in her jaw tightening. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she replied, her voice growing colder. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. But you see, Mademoiselle Havelock, the person who suggested such an idea, the perfect alibi to conceal a crime, must have had their own reasons, and those reasons are rooted in a motive far deeper than merely protecting Sebastian." Cordelia's lips parted slightly, her composure cracking for the briefest moment. Poirot leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "You wanted Olivia out of the way, didn't you? Her knowledge of your family's secrets, her control over your inheritance. It was a threat to everything you held dear." The room was silent for a long moment, and then Cordelia let out a soft sigh, her shoulders dropping as if the weight of the truth had become too much to bear. "Yes," she said quietly. "I did what I had to do." Poirot's voice was steady, yet filled with a quiet sadness. "I knew there was more to this story, mademoiselle, and now you will face the consequences." The finality of his words hung in the room as Cordelia's fate was sealed. Her carefully constructed life had crumbled, and now, like Sebastian, she would be held accountable for her actions. The silence in Cordelia's room settled like a weight, thick and unyielding. She stood before Poirot, the very essence of her previous poise shattered. Her lips trembled slightly, and her gaze, which had been filled with calculated detachment, now seemed distant and hollow, as though she were processing the full extent of her actions. "Is this what you wanted, Mademoiselle Havelock?" Poirot asked softly, his voice devoid of judgment but nonetheless pointed in its inquiry. Cordelia's shoulders sagged, and for the first time since their meeting, she seemed small, fragile. "I wanted freedom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wanted everything to be mine. I couldn't let her stand in my way, not when she had the power to destroy me with a single word." There was a tremor in her tone, but Poirot knew the truth of her words. The greed and desperation that had driven her to murder were clear. She had done what was necessary, as she saw it, to preserve her carefully crafted life. But it was all for nothing now. "You were willing to sacrifice everything, your family, your name, your integrity," Poirot murmured, the words rolling off his tongue with the precision of someone who had already seen the conclusion unfold in his mind. "And yet, for all your plotting, it was your own hand that would undo you." Cordelia's breath caught, and she cast a quick glance toward the window, as though she were looking for an escape from the suffocating truth of the moment. But there was no escape now. Poirot's eyes never left hers. "It is strange," he continued almost to himself, "how a single act can unravel the lives of so many people, and yet, in the end, it is always the simplest of truths that remain. The one who feels the most pressure, the most need to hide their sins, often leaves the most obvious trail behind them. You, Cordelia, were no exception." She gave a half-laugh, bitter and resigned. "And what now? Will you turn me over to the police? Will they arrest me, lock me away forever?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, mademoiselle, that is not my way." The words caught her off guard, and she stared at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" Poirot stood, straightening his coat and adjusting his cufflinks. "I do not simply expose crimes. I seek to understand the why, the motivations, the people behind the crimes. You are not a mere victim of circumstances, Cordelia. You chose your path, and for that you will pay the price. But in a way, that is for the law to determine." Cordelia looked down at her hands, which she had clasped tightly in front of her. For the first time since their conversation began, she seemed to shrink into herself, as though the full weight of her actions had finally settled in. "And Sebastian?" she asked, her voice suddenly smaller than before. Poirot's lips twitched. "Ah, Sebastian. The accomplice, the willing participant in your scheme, but hardly the mastermind. He was your tool, Cordelia. But it is not he who will be held responsible for this particular crime. No, it is you. And I think, deep down, you understand that." Cordelia looked at him, her face pale, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "What will happen to him, then?" "He will face the consequences of his actions, of course. But the truth is, he did not have the strength to carry out this scheme on his own. He was led astray by you, guided by your ambition. It is you who must bear the blame." Her lips trembled, but she nodded slowly, as though she had expected this conclusion all along. "I suppose I've made my bed," she said quietly, "and now I must lie in it." Poirot said nothing. His gaze softened, as though he recognized the human frailty that had led Cordelia to this point. It was a flaw he had seen in so many others, but one that always seemed to carry a weight of its own. It was a reminder that no one, no matter how clever or cunning, could entirely escape their own conscience. "You will return to your family," Poirot continued, "but I do not believe they will see you as the woman they once knew. You have already lost everything you sought to preserve in the pursuit of your own ambitions. In the end, it was the consequences of your choices that sealed your fate." Cordelia swallowed hard, but she said nothing. She simply stood there, lost in thought. Poirot could see that she was already facing the inevitable, a reality she had long feared but could no longer avoid. The consequences of her actions were now clear, and she would have to answer for them sooner or later. With a final look, Poirot turned on his heel and walked toward the door. Hamilton, who had been waiting in the hallway, gave him a questioning look as Poirot emerged from the room. There was a quiet understanding between them, though Hamilton still seemed to be processing the gravity of the situation. "Is it over, Poirot?" Hamilton asked quietly as they walked down the hallway together. Poirot gave a small nod. "For the most part. There is one more matter to attend to. A final piece of the puzzle, if you will." Hamilton raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Poirot glanced toward the stairs, where the rest of the family would soon gather to discuss the resolution of the case. "It is always the smallest detail, mon ami. The one thing no one pays attention to. That final clue that remains overlooked until the very end." Hamilton's brow furrowed in confusion. "But you've already solved it. You've found the murderer." Poirot smiled gently, though there was an unmistakable intensity in his gaze. "Ah, but there is more, my friend. Much more. A final truth that has yet to be revealed." They descended the stairs, the weight of the investigation still heavy in the air. As they entered the drawing room, Poirot's mind was already racing ahead, assembling the final pieces of a puzzle that seemed deceptively simple at first glance. But Poirot knew better than anyone. The simplest truths often hid the most complex and unexpected answers. As they walked into the room, the other members of the household were already gathered. Julian Havelock, now clearly weighed down by the events of the past few hours, sat in a chair with his head in his hands. Olivia Havelock, still shocked by the revelations, clutched a handkerchief in her lap, her eyes filled with disbelief. Poirot paused for a moment, scanning the group with his practiced eye, taking in every subtle shift in posture, every twitch of the eye, every breath. And then, with a quiet breath, he began. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice calm but unwavering. "I have come to one final realization. The puzzle that we have all been so eagerly trying to solve, well, it is not as complete as it first seemed." The room fell silent, and the eyes of the household shifted toward him, waiting for the final revelation. Poirot let the silence stretch a moment longer, the hush in, the drawing-room thickening with apprehension. Each face before him bore a different shade of anticipation. Julian's bleak weariness, Olivia's barely restrained grief, Sebastian's tightened jaw, and Cordelia's inward gaze, as though she were bracing for one final blow. "You believe the matter is concluded," Poirot said softly, pacing to the center of the room. "That justice has been served and the curtain drawn. But there remains a thread, small and stubborn, which refuses to lie flat. One detail, singular but persistent, has disturbed my little grey cells." He turned toward Julian. "Monsieur Havelock, you told me that you were in your study on the night of Constance's death, yes?" Julian nodded slowly. "Yes, as I told the inspector. I was going through estate paperwork. I had been at it for hours." "And yet," Poirot continued, "you also told me that you did not hear the music box play that night." Julian blinked, confused. "Yes, that's correct. I was too far from the sitting room." "Ah, but therein lies the puzzle," Poirot said, his eyes glinting. "Because the music box, the one that Constance kept in her cabinet, was most certainly heard by someone. Not just heard, but moved. Its tune was familiar, yet you insisted you never heard it." Julian's face paled slightly. "What are you implying?" Poirot turned, addressing the room now. The music box was set to play by the murderer, to fix the time of death and create an illusion, an auditory alibi. Cordelia hoped the sound would suggest Constance was alive after she had already been killed. But someone who knew the box, its tune, its pattern, would have recognized that it was out of place. Too soon, too staged. Olivia straightened slightly. "Poirot, please. What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Cordelia orchestrated the murder, yes, and Sebastian assisted. But the plan, the very idea to use the music box, to manipulate time and memory, that required a deeper knowledge of the household, a subtler mind." He turned to face Julian again. "You are not the detached patriarch you pretended to be. You were not merely absent. You were watching." Julian shook his head, rising unsteadily to his feet. "That's absurd. I loved my wife. Why would I ever—" "Because Constance had rewritten her will," Poirot interrupted, his tone sharper. "You claimed ignorance when I asked about her finances, but the solicitor revealed she had removed all secondary beneficiaries, including you. Everything was to go to Olivia. Not even Cordelia knew of this. But you did, because Constance told you, and that, Monsieur Havelock, is when the clock began to tick." There was a murmur in the room, but Poirot raised a hand for silence. "You had motive, you had opportunity, and, unlike Cordelia, you had the subtlety. The murder weapon, the tea laced with aconite, it was your idea. Cordelia may have carried it out, but it was you who suggested how. She admitted as much without realizing it." Julian's mouth opened, but no words emerged. His face had gone ashen. "You had no intention of being left penniless," Poirot went on, his voice lower now, more intimate, as though drawing Julian toward confession. "You believed that by letting Cordelia do the deed, you would remain safe. A grieving husband, hands clean, conscience untouched." Julian sat back down heavily. The room was completely still. "Cordelia took the risk," Poirot said. "Sebastian followed, but the strings were yours to pull, and for a while, It worked. You let Cordelia hang herself in her own net. But you forgot one thing. I, Hercule Poirot, do not stop merely because the surface appears smooth. Julian looked at Poirot now, the fight gone from his eyes. I never touched her, he said hoarsely. I never poured the tea. That was Cordelia. She wanted Constance gone. She may have wanted it, Poirot agreed. But you gave her permission. You whispered encouragement. You guided her steps, and you sat in your study, telling yourself it was not your hand that tipped the poison. Cordelia's eyes widened. You, she said, turning to Julian. You told me. You said it was just an idea. You said it would never really happen. Julian didn't meet her gaze. You were going to do it anyway. I only made sure it wouldn't fail. A gasp escaped Olivia's lips. Father, how could you? Julian exhaled deeply, his voice now hollow. I did what I had to do. After all these years of loyalty, of supporting her through scandal after scandal, to be discarded like a servant. She was going to humiliate me, strip everything from me. Poirot's voice was soft now. You justified it to yourself. But in the end, you used your daughter to commit murder. That is your true crime. Julian buried his face in his hands, the proud patriarch finally crumbling. Poirot turned to Hamilton. You may inform Inspector Moreau. He will wish to take statements. Monsieur Havelock is to be charged as an accessory to murder. Cordelia will face her own charges, and Sebastian must answer for his part. Hamilton nodded grimly and stepped out of the room. Poirot remained still, letting the consequences unfold in silence. Cordelia sat frozen, the betrayal etched into every line of her face. Julian did not move. Olivia, tears streaming silently, rose and left the room. Poirot waited a moment longer, then turned and walked slowly to the hallway. The long case clock ticked solemnly in the corridor as he paused, placing his hand on the banister. Madame Constance Havelock had orchestrated many things in her life, her marriage, her family, her estate. But in the end, it was her silent watchfulness, her decision to change her will, that had shattered the illusion of unity within the house. Justice would follow as surely as dawn. But Poirot, ever the student of human behavior, knew there were no victors here, only survivors. Outside, the evening was cooling, the last blush of sunset fading behind the distant hills. Poirot adjusted his hat and stepped into the deepening dusk, the burden of yet another mystery resolved resting quietly on his shoulders. And far behind him, in the house full of secrets, the last note of the music box echoed in memory, soft, precise, and irreversible.